Hi everyone and welcome back to the course. In this video, we will talk about how you can create a reference architecture integrated with the DevOps. In the previous video, we were looking at the different processes of the IT delivery and how it is integrated into the DevOps. So any DevOps architecture will have to address planning, development, integration, deployment, and operations. But we have to keep in mind why we're doing DevOps. And this is to achieve the business goals in a faster, more agile way and to continuously improve products. The DevOps architecture doesn't stand on its own. It has to be linked to an enterprise architecture. To do that, we're normally using the Open Group architecture framework designed with architecture development method to draft architecture. And this is what you can see in front of you. In the figure right here, you can see the architecture development method. So just like the DevOps, the architecture development method is a cycle, except in the very first phase, which is where the need for architecture is formed. This has to be done in tier 1 in the sourcing model that we discussed in the previous video, and the core of the architecture development methodology is a sequence of architecture design which is business first and setting the principles and the requirements for the actual solution. Those principles drive the architecture data usage, the applications, and finally the technology that will be used. This is important because architecture is not about technology in the first place. Technology is purely the ability to achieve business goals in the enterprise level. So the architecture developing method assumes that the architecture is not static. It changes as soon as the business requirements change too. If the business demands change, there will likely be a need to adapt to the architecture in the future solutions. So, as we discussed in the previous video, there were 3 tiers, and in tier 1 is where the goals are set for the entire enterprise. In the next level, in tier 2, is where the DevOps teams will translate the goals into product features and start developing the product. DevOps teams will have to work according a set of principles. So let's take a closer look at those principles. So in fact, there are actually 6 DevOps agile skills principles, and those are very first the customer centric action, which is to develop an application with the customer in mind, what they need and what does the customer expect in terms of functionality. There is also the goal of another concept, domain driven design, which contains good practices and ideas. Then, when you build a project, you always need to have the end result in mind, or how will the product look when it is completely finished. With the end-to-end product in mind, it comes the end-to-end responsibility. And here the teams need to be motivated and enabled to take responsibility from the start to the finish of the product lifecycle. Principles such as you build it, you run it, you break it, and you fix it is one of the key principles for taking responsibility. Then we need a cross-functional automation teams. They need to be able to make decisions themselves in the development process. Then, as we talked in the previous video, a continuous improvement is quite important for every project, and we need to continuously improve our product. And finally, in order for our project to be very efficient, the goal of the teams should be to always automate as much as possible. The only way to regain speed in delivering and deploying is by automating as much as possible. Automation also limits the occurrence of failures and bugs in your code. So, based on these principles, they're leading to some architecture statements that are the core of the DevOps. Those principles are automation, which is basically responsible for automating everything. With automation, the amount of time between testing and deployment will be significantly reduced, enabling a faster release process. But on the other hand, automation will also lead to way less manual interaction and therefore less errors. The next architecture statement is collaboration. So you remember two of the six principles are cross-functional automation and end-to-end responsibility. This can be only achieved by a very good collaboration. Development and operations will have to work very closely together to speed up the delivery and the releases. Although this is also a cultural change, collaboration requires common toolset that supplies that collaboration. So automation also requires a clear portfolio that contains building blocks that can be automated easily. These building blocks are called artifacts in the ADM cycle, and they represent packages of functionality that can be used to fulfill requirements. Some of the most famous tools for keeping artifacts are, for example, Artifactory. The building block is reusable and replaceable, and therefore it must be clearly specified and defined. So the configuration of the building blocks needs to be well documented and brought under control of the configuration management. If this is done well, those building blocks will also have clear interfaces so that they can be fully automated. And finally, let's talk about integration, which is where the development and the operations come together. In DevOps, we integrate the business demands and the IT delivery user stories. Code is normally integrated with new functionality that is coming out of the business demand. The demand is changing faster those days, so development needs to keep in mind the continuous integration. This will lead to changes that adopt new development at some very good speed. So the final step to merge the DevOps principles into one model for our reference architecture is to build the reference architecture model. So the model contains two main cycles, and as you can see from the figure, there is outer cycle, which is right here, and also there is an inner cycle. So the outer cycle is the product cycle, while the inner cycle represents the operational activities. And so as a logical consequence, the outer cycle is governed by the enterprise itself. The inner cycle, it's about actually delivering the product using DevOps. And as you can see, there are interfaces between the outer and the inner cycles. And those are collaboration, automation, integration, configuration management, and the interface layer. So in the outer cycle, the business goals are translated into architecture. From the architecture, a portfolio is created with business blocks to create products and services. Products are released to the market and adopted, but due to changing demands, there will be requests for changes. So those changes will drive new enterprise planning and some change into the business goals. So in that way, the business will continuously absorb the change in demands. So the plans and the actual builds are expected to be executed into the inner circle, as you can see here. In this circle, the product is broken down into product backlog items that will be developed and eventually operated by the DevOps teams. These teams do not operate by themselves, but they are triggered from the outer cycle. So this is why we need the interface layer. This is the interface between the business and the execution teams doing the IT delivery. So there is a collaboration between the architecture and development. And as we mentioned before, the releases should be automated as much as possible. And so requests and changes should be integrated with the planning on the backlog of the DevOps teams. And so the builds are pushed to production, and those ones that are actually pushed, they need to be monitored and brought under control from the configuration management. So let's see how this would actually work in practice by the next figure. So here you have some people within the model that you saw in the previous slide. And this is basically the DevOps workflow for enterprises. So you can see that from the enterprise, we're getting the business plan, and then this is passed to the business unit. From there, it goes to the product owner, which distributes the work to the different teams. On the other hand, the enterprise architect works with a security officer to build the enterprise architecture that translates into portfolio that builds a roadmap. From there, we can actually trigger the DevOps cycle where we create a product, architecture and backlog, and we're running continuously everything on pipeline in order to implement every new change and have a continuous development and integration. So I hope that from this video, guys, you really got a good introduction on how DevOps is implemented into IT delivery. That's it. Thank you very much for watching. And in the next video, we will talk about the DevOps components.